Hi, my name is Katarina Sullivan and I would like to welcome you to my YouTube channel. It's finally starting to get cold here in Canberra. My cold weather asthma is starting to set in and my voice is sounding rather different today. Please excuse my voice. Before I dive into today's topic, I actually want to go on a little bit of a rant. Last night I went to the Kingston Politics in the pub and heard the candidates speak. In the entire room, there was probably less than 5 people under the age of 30. I might have been the only person there under the age of 25, might have been. There would have been 10 people in the room under the age of 40. The people I hear the most complaints from about the government are young people. And when candidates offer the opportunity to actually meet them and ask questions and have a discussion, we should be turning up. We shouldn't be having better things to do on a Sunday than going to a political forum if we're going to complain about politics. So I know I spoke a little bit about this in my last video about not turning up to vote and then complaining about the future of the country. It's really important that you turn up to these candidate forums as well. I know there's heaps all around Canberra at the moment and in locations all across Australia. Candidates have mobile offices, they're out at coffee shops, they're out at local shopping centres, they have buses, they have you name it. And they're wanting to meet people, so make sure you do actually go out of your way to attend these forums and hear what they have to say and ask the questions that are really, really important. This message is especially important for young people because last night when I was sitting in the room and there were a lot of people in their 50s and 60s and over, they're not the people that the decisions are going to be made for that will impact them for the next 60, 70 years. The decisions that politicians make today are going to impact my life for years and years into the future. And so I'm one of the most important age demographics to actually be at these events because I'm the one that they're going to have to be looking at a future vision for, as well as all the people around my age range. Young people are some of the most important parts of the political equation because we're going to be here hopefully for another 60, 70, maybe 80 years. These decisions will affect us for the rest of our lives. And it's important that these decisions are made in consultation with us. It shouldn't be people who are in their 60s and 70s and have been through the workforce and now retired. They shouldn't be the only ones showing up to these events. Of course, issues around retirees and pensioners are really important, and I actually raised one of those issues at the forum last night. But they only make up a really small percentage of the population. But last night, they were the biggest demographic that was represented. And it's fantastic for people in that demographic, but young people, we need to be getting out there. So Google when your next candidate forum is, reach out to your candidates and ask them when they're holding an event, meet them, go out to their mobile offices, stalk them on Instagram, it's totally okay because I do it all the time. But go and ask those questions, be engaged in the process, please. On that note, let's get on with the video. Today I'm talking about the pros and cons of independent candidates and minor parties. A few people have asked me whether or not they should vote for an independent or a minor party. It depends on the independent candidate or the minor party candidate. Some pros and cons that we've recently seen with independent candidates and minor party candidates are that they can sometimes hold up the political process. So there is absolutely nothing wrong with voting for an independent or a minor party candidate, but make sure you do actually speak to them about how they're going to act in either the lower house or the upper house respectively. You want to find out that while they're going to take really great action for your electorate, that they're not going to be only focused on the electorate and not focused on the bigger picture of Australia. I have heard in the past couple of weeks candidates talk about the fact that they want to prioritise their state or electorate, and that's great. It's a great way to win votes because people tend to be very parochial and very proud. I know as soon as someone says we're going to do X, Y, and Z for Canberra, I'm like fist pumping in the air, really excited. But then when you take a step back and reflect, you need to make sure that it's actually the best thing for the entire country as well. One of the really recent examples in politics that I could draw from is the share of the GST in Western Australia. Now, I 100% agree that GST needs to be per capita and that Western Australia deserves a greater share. I might get yelled at for this, but coming from Western Australia and knowing how big the state is and how difficult it is to have the infrastructure in place for such isolation between towns and the single city that we have, we do need a big portion of tax revenue to come to Western Australia. Now, what you want to be careful of with an independent or minor party is, for example, in this GST revenue situation, that they're not looking for a greater share of GST than what is actually reasonable. And the reason I bring this up is sometimes with the minor parties and independents, because they don't have that entire Australia focus, because sometimes they won't have national leadership across the entire country, they don't see the big picture. Bottom line is, I agree that WA should get more GST equal to GST per capita. However, they shouldn't get more than GST per capita. And hypothetically, if a Western Australian independent candidate or West Australia minor party was to argue for more than the GST per capita, then that wouldn't have an approach that would be beneficial for the whole country. And it's really important that because we are one entire nation, that we work together as an entire nation. So one thing to watch out for with independent candidates and minor parties is to make sure that while they're taking the electorate and or state or territory's best interests at heart, that they're still working for the better of Australia as a whole. The other thing to be careful of with independent and minor party candidates is who they're going to side with in the case of a hung parliament. We've spoken about this in an earlier video, but if Labor and the Liberal National Coalition win the same amount of seats or very similar amount of seats, they can try and form a coalition with other parties to actually win the most seats in the lower house in order to form government. Now, in order to do this, they will form coalitions with independent or minor party candidates. And you need to make sure when you're voting for an independent or minor party that you know who they'll go into coalition with, because while you might like their values, you might prefer, when it comes down to the two major party preferred system, you might prefer that they actually go into coalition with a different party. You need to be really careful of the fact that it's going to be a very close election and there could be coalitions formed. Another thing that's really important to speak to your minor party and independent candidates about is if there's a bill that they mostly agree with that's up in Parliament, will they pass it and then try to amend it after the fact, or would they block it? Something that we've seen in both the upper and lower house is the blocking of important bills by both minor party and independent candidates. Sometimes they actually mostly agree with the bill, but they just want one or two things changed and they're holding that bill hostage. The best thing for the country is if bills are passed when they have a majority of support and are amended later, so we can actually get the process of government happening and then deal with the amendment after the fact. This is what's best, of course, for the people of the country, not for the politicians. So it's something that's really important to speak to your minor party candidates and your independent candidates about is, will they hold bills at ransom, or will they pass bills that they mostly agree with and then look to move an amendment afterwards? So some pros of minor parties and independent candidates, like I said before, they do look at working for the electorate in which they operate, or the state or territory in which they operate. That means they'll often have your best interests at heart. Something that we're seeing this election is a lot of discontent with both of the major parties because they're unhappy with how party politics is playing out. So a great thing about minor party candidates, and especially independent candidates, is that you don't have as much of that party politics. So when I say party politics, I'm talking about going back to my fruit and vegetable examples. If you haven't heard about my fruit and vegetable examples, you need to watch my previous videos because we had some awesome fruit and vegetable candidates in parties. I'm going to go ahead and use the example of the citrus party. And let's say they had a policy that peels of fruit should be used in cooking instead of thrown away. Don't mind me while I'm like ripping this off the top of my head. Let's say mandarin is in the citrus party, but the mandarin peel isn't really good for much, so they disagree with the policy. However, publicly they have to say that they agree with it because that's what the party wants. There's a little bit of party politics that comes into play where a candidate might not necessarily agree, but will need to go along with it anyway because of the party policy. So minor party candidates and independent candidates don't seem to have that same issue. You might see it every now and again in a minor party, but definitely not in independent candidates, and definitely not as frequently as you do with the major parties. The other fantastic thing about minor parties and independent candidates is that they fill a political hole. If you have a look at the ABC's Vote Compass, you'll see where all the major parties are positioned in terms of the political spectrum for social and economic development. The one thing that's weirdly left off the Vote Compass is environmental, progressive or conservative, because that should be its own little category. We talk about politics in terms of three main categories: economic, social or environmental, and we put this on a little graph. So we have an X and Y axis for economic and social development. I always use a third axis, the Z axis, if you remember your high school geometry, and I put environmental, conservative and progressive along that. And the reason I do that is because I know people who are socially conservative but environmentally progressive, and socially progressive and environmentally conservative. I think it's really important that we don't just say everyone who cares about the environment also cares about LGBTQI rights or rights for assisted dying or some of those social topics, because that's not the case. Going back to this Vote Compass and why I'm talking about it, what you will see at the moment is that you can either be on the right or on the left, or you can be really, really right or really, really left, and there's not a lot of people in the center. There's not a lot of people that fall on the spectrum of conservative in one area but progressive in another area. And that's what's really missing. I know for my political beliefs, which actually really closely line up with the Sustainable Development Goals, there isn't a party that fits what I want to see in Australian politics right now, but there are some independent candidates standing for what I believe in. That's the really fantastic thing about independent candidates, is that they give a voice to Australians that don't fit into that little quadrant as the major parties might. So there are some pros and there are some cons when it comes to minor party and independent candidates. My biggest piece of advice is make sure that you speak to your candidates, make sure you get to know them and know what they're about, know how they're going to act, how they're going to vote, who they're going to form alliance with if it comes to a hung parliament. An important piece of information I should put out there is that candidates from minor parties, or actually all candidates that get at least 4% of the vote, do actually get funding for their political campaign. So if you do want to see a minor party or independent candidate get up and you know that they're probably not going to get into the lower house or the Senate, you're more than welcome to go ahead and put a 1 in the box next to their name. And that will actually mean that if they do get 4% of the vote, they get funding. So if they're championing something you believe in, don't be afraid to vote first for them, and then you can go ahead and put your major party second, and the major party won't lose any votes. Only difference is in the Senate, don't forget about the transfer value. So if you do put 1 next to your independent or minor party candidate and 2 next to your major party candidate, the minor party votes will be transferred at a lesser rate to the second preference candidate. Make sure you go and watch how the Senate votes are counted, that video, if you don't know what in the God's green earth I'm talking about. So keep that in mind if you do vote 1 for an independent or minor party candidate. Otherwise, the lower house, they just get distributed to the second preference, third preference, and so on and so forth. So it's not too big of a deal, as long as the major party doesn't get the absolute least votes in the first count in the lower house, but I'm sure that probably won't happen. If you learned something in this video or liked the content, please give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe to my channel. Any comments or questions about politics, drop them below. And next video, we're going to talk about how to analyze party policies. So we're getting into the juicy stuff of the election. And then from then on, it's all policy information. So make sure that if you need to brush up on how to cast your vote, go back through the last few videos. There's heaps of information. We've spoken about so much in this mini series. Thank you all for your continuing feedback, and I will see you next time.